Chalk Talk podcast. Today we will be looking at the NFL Divisional Round of games, looking at FanDuel and DraftKings. This is going to be 4 games, 8 teams. My typical co-host, Tyler Beaker, is a bit under the weather this week, but you know what they say about Tylers, they're a dime a dozen. So I went out and found myself a new Tyler. We've got Tyler Loechner on the podcast making his Chalk Talk debut. Tyler's been with PFF even longer than I have. He's a veteran and a savvy DFS player. Tyler Beaker, who's at home right now listening to this on a sick day. Sorry you couldn't make it, buddy. You will be sorely missed. But Tyler Loechner, it's your time to shine.
What's up, everybody? Good. Thanks for having me here, Scott. I hope I'm as good as the original Tyler. Love listening to you guys every week. So ready for the divisional round, my favorite weekend of football here.
So, and of course, that's probably because you're a Patriots fan and your team's always in it. But if you've been listening to this podcast, you know we don't mess around too much. We just try and deliver the goods. We just want to make you money, give out the best analysis, the best stats, talking about the players. So we won't mess around too much. I will mention just 3 things. One, this analysis is catered more towards tournaments than cash games. I don't play cash in postseason DFS. I know Tyler doesn't either. I also want to say we're going to talk about some gross names on this slate. While James White, Eric Decker aren't good on paper plays, that's fine in a week where there's really such a limited player pool and not much value elsewhere. So just keep that in mind. Like if we're talking up James White or Eric Decker, guys like that, it's not because, we love them from a raw projection standpoint. It's just, it's hard to find value this week. And also late swap. Be sure to utilize late swap if you have a lineup that's drawing dead. Not perfect, just definitely drawing dead. You have nothing to lose and everything to gain to switch off to a more low-owned, high-risk player. Tyler, let's just dive right into this and start off by looking at Atlanta at Philadelphia. Atlanta is favored by 2.5. We'll start off with Matt Ryan, and here's why I'm pessimistic. I know that this is what's considered a pass funnel defense. Philadelphia is being passed on at 65.4% of the time. That's the highest rate in the league. The ranked 3rd best in yards per carry allowed. Still not optimistic. So there's been 158 instances of a quarterback scoring at least 18.5 fantasy points in a single game this season. Matt Ryan has accounted for none of these. After Foles, Ryan ranks ahead of only Marcus Mariota by 0.2 fantasy points per game as the lowest scoring quarterback available on this slate. Although Philadelphia is being passed on at a really high rate, they still rank top 10 in schedule-adjusted fantasy points allowed per game to quarterbacks, top 10 in opposing passer rating, top 10 in fantasy points allowed per dropback. I am not interested. Tyler, are you interested in Matt Ryan at all?
I'm not interested in Matt Ryan either. He was a much better real-life quarterback this year. Yeah, number 2 PFF grade, but that didn't really translate to fantasy goodness. He didn't throw for more than 2 touchdowns in any game this year. He hasn't thrown for more than 1 touchdown in any game since week 12. I'm a little more interested in Ryan on if I'm going to play him. Obviously, we've got a limited player pool this week. He's the 6th most expensive on DraftKings and 4th most expensive on FanDuel. So he's off the board for me on FanDuel, but at the number 6 position on DraftKings, there's a little bit of interest. But no, I'm definitely interested in some other guys this week.
Nick Foles is another guy I'm really not interested in at all. In week 15, he did finish as fantasy's 4th highest scoring quarterback up against the Giants, but the Giants ended the season allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. I know Landon Collins was hurt in that game. After that, in 5 quarters against some equally unimposing pass defenses, Oakland, Dallas, Foles completed just 23 of 49 passes for 202 yards, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions. It was their single worst rated quarterback over the last 2 weeks of the season. Really nothing about the matchup stands out. Atlanta's good at slowing down the pace of games. Their defense is playing a lot better. They've won 7 of their last 9 games, but they still rank slightly below average in most statistics I'll look at for quarterbacks. I did want to mention something that no one's talking about, and that is, so I'm from the New York City area. On WFAN's The Afternoon Drive, which replaced Mike Francesa's show, Chris Carlin, who used to do radio work focusing on the Eagles in Philadelphia, he speculated that Foles' recent poor play is linked to Foles' elbow injury that he suffered this preseason. He added that this otherwise would have required surgery, but the team kept him active in case they needed a spot starter too. Another Eagles beat writer I talked to admitted that this was a fair concern. Though the extra week off might help with this, he's just definitely a guy I have little interest in. What about you, Tyler?
Yeah, Foles is interesting because obviously he had the 4-touchdown game against the Giants in week 15 and then followed it up with completing 50% of his passes for 163 yards, 1 score, 1 pick in week 16 against the Raiders, which should have been an even better matchup. Foles didn't throw for more than 250 yards in either of those 2 games, though. So he's a low floor play. But you got to look at those 4 touchdowns, and you still have to think he's a high floor play with Zach Ertz in the red zone. Alshon Jeffrey, Nelson Aguilar, all these guys can score touchdowns. I don't hate Nick Foles in tournaments. Like we said at the beginning, neither of us play cash. If you're playing cash, don't play Nick Foles. And if you're making a bunch of tournament lineups, Foles should not be your highest owned quarterback. But a little bit of exposure is okay with me. Since everyone thinks he's just the worst player ever right now, his ownership is going to be extremely low. So there's some good leverage there.
So moving on to the running backs and looking at Atlanta, it's really intriguing how this is almost a perfectly even split among the running backs, except near the end zone. Last week, Devonta Freeman, 18 carries, 14 for Tevin Coleman. Coleman saw 3 targets. 2 Freeman's 2 targets. The matchup implies that Atlanta should lean heavier on the running backs of the passing game. Philadelphia is allowing the fewest rushing fantasy points per game to running backs, but the 14th most receiving fantasy points per game, still outside of Devonta Freeman's 11 target week 17. It's hard to count on a viable receiving workload for these running backs. And really just the near even workload has me avoiding both this week. It's just a really brutal matchup. Philadelphia is the only defense to allow under 1,000 rushing yards to running backs this season. I mean, Freeman could definitely score like 2 touchdowns and just destroy all of my lineups, but I'm really not seeing it, and I'm not too excited about either of these names, but I want to hear you make your pitch.
Yeah, I don't really have any interest in either of these players. Freeman more so than Coleman. I think Coleman's totally off my board. Freeman does have a touchdown in 4 of his past 5 games, though. Like you said, near even workload except near the red zone, which is obviously huge for DFS, getting those touchdowns. The Falcons are favorites, so there's something to be said for Freeman's touchdown upside there. But Coleman, on FanDuel, he has fewer than 10 FanDuel points in 4 of his past 5 games. And the Eagles, like you said, gave up the second fewest fantasy points to running backs this year. I believe they gave up fewer than 1,000 rushing yards also. They were the only team defense to hold opposing running backs below 1,000 yards. Just 6 rushing touchdowns given up all year. It's a low floor, low ceiling game, like you said. Even if Freeman scores twice, is he gonna gain enough yards to really give you that GPP winning upside? I'm not sure. Coleman's completely off my board. Freeman, I'll have a little bit of exposure, but I'm with you on this one. I think there's better spots to attack this week.
I will say both running backs have been 2 of the most efficient running backs of the past 2 seasons, and they could definitely hit for a big game. Tevin Coleman's very cheap, but those are just running backs I never target. I always chase volume, and it's worked out well for me, so I'm going to be avoiding these running backs this week. Jay Ajayi, I think, is legitimately intriguing, and especially so on DraftKings, where he's $2,300 cheaper. His usage has not been good by any means, but it's been much better than the other running backs. He's averaging 5.0 expected fantasy points more per game than Blunt and Clement, who are fairly even over the last 4 weeks. And Ajayi has more targets than any other running back on the team over this stretch. He was inactive for week 17, which ideally implies they were hoping to get him fresh legs for a big postseason workload. He's really been one of our most efficient and highest graded running backs for 2 seasons now. Philadelphia has a top 5 run blocking unit. Last 4 weeks, 14, 12, 15, 9 carries, 2, 2, 2, 4 targets. If Foles is legitimately hurt, and even if not, just because of how poor his play has been, could see a heavy workload. He's not going to be a guy I'm too heavily invested in, but like I said, I could see it. Could make arguments in that direction, and he is a lot cheaper on DraftKings.
Yeah, the only thing Ajayi really has going for him is his price on DraftKings. The matchup isn't good. The Falcons have only given up 4 rushing touchdowns to opposing running backs since week 3. They have only allowed 1 team to gain over 100 rushing yards on them since week 8. So the Falcons, their run defense is hot. The Ajayi splits work with LeGarrette Blount. I never play Ajayi, so take this with a grain of salt, but I'm not going to play him again this weekend. His price is intriguing, but the matchup and the workload split with Blount and the fact that they're underdogs and Nick Foles is their quarterback, there's a lot of negatives in this area that I just don't think you need to attack here.
Right. You could even make an argument for Clement just based on the fact that the Falcons are giving up the 2nd most receiving fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, and he ranked worst in that same category last season. But like I said, I mean, Ajayi is seeing a better receiving workload in recent weeks. But either way, it's not good for any of the running backs. Just moving on to the wide receivers, I think Sanu is a good value on FanDuel, but it's a tough matchup for him. He runs 68% of his routes from the slot. Philadelphia is allowing the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game to slot wide receivers. Sanu really hasn't been too matchup sensitive this season, but that's enough to pull me off him and lean Ginn on FanDuel. Justin Hardy saw just 1 target last week. He's not in play. Julio Jones, I think, is legitimately interesting.
So I want all of the Julio.
Yes.
Yeah, I want all of the Julio this weekend.
I love to hear that. So you look at his efficiency numbers where he ranks 3rd in expected fantasy points per game, 10th in actual fantasy points per game. That implies a great workload and poor efficiency. But I looked into it. It's like he's still the same old hyper efficient Julio. He led the league in yards per route run for the 4th time over his past 5 seasons. He's just been really unlucky at scoring touchdowns. He ranks 3rd in expected touchdowns with 10, but he scored only 3. Now I'm inclined to just hammer the regression to that mean, spot him, maybe 4.5 more additional touchdowns, and treat him as though he's really rivaling Brown as one of the top wide receivers on his slate. Like I said, volume has been good. He's seen double-digit targets in 6 of his last 8 games, and the matchup looks soft as well. Philadelphia's allowing the most fantasy points per game to outside wide receivers, 8th most to schedule-adjusted fantasy points per game, 2 wide receiver ones. And what is interesting is since week 6, including the postseason, he leads all players in target market share, implying that if this game is a pass-heavy affair, the spread's only within 3, implying shootout potential. Philadelphia is being passed on at the highest rate of any defense. Atlanta's passed on at the 6th highest rate of any defense. Could be a monster Julio eruption spot. I like him a lot. Tyler, let's hear your case for him.
Yeah, everything you said I agree with. We pulled up a similar stat. I noted that between weeks 1 through 8, Julio only saw double-digit targets twice, but since week 8, he has seen double-digit targets in 7 of his past 10. He also has 80 yards and or a touchdown in 3 straight games. All of this workload, you just mentioned that the market share, the Falcons are using Julio the way that he should be used. I think our boss here, Jeff Ratcliffe, tweeted out something that Julio actually saw 16 end zone targets this year, which tied a career high of his. So there is definitely some positive regression coming in that area. We saw it a little bit last week with that Matt Ryan split touchdown throw to Julio Jones. And Philadelphia corner Jalen Mills gave up 9 touchdowns this year while in coverage, and no other cornerback gave up more than 7. So this is, like you said, the eruption Julio spot. I'm all in.
You're filling in for Tyler B admirably. I think every single podcast we've talked about wanting to target Jalen Mills in coverage.
It works.
Let's look at the wide receivers on Philadelphia's side. Just what stands out to me is very little interest in Torrey Smith, who has just 22 yards over the last 3 weeks with Nick Foles. Alshon Jeffrey, very little interest. Saw just 2 targets in each of the last 2 weeks with Foles. Atlanta's allowing the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to outside wide receivers. If forced to choose, I got to go with Nelson Aguilar. It was one of the best matchups of any wide receiver this week. Atlanta's ranked bottom 5 in fantasy points per game allowed to slot wide receivers for 2 straight seasons. Aguilar runs 86% of his routes from the slot. He's averaging about 2 targets per quarter, so 8 targets per game or per 4 quarters with Wentz. And production's been fine as well. I'm not in love with him, but I think he's in play. What would you say, Tyler?
I actually really do like Aguilar this week. He's the only Eagles wideout that I think I'm targeting this weekend. He gained the 3rd most yards out of the slot this year behind Larry the Legend and Golden Tate. Atlanta's slot man Brian Poole gave up a reception once every 7 snaps while in coverage in the slot, and that was the 2nd highest rate among all starting slot corners this year. So it's a great matchup. Aguilar's been extremely efficient out of the slot. He's got touchdown potential, and he's very cheap. I think he's under 5,000 on DraftKings. So yeah, Aguilar's, I actually think, a really good play this weekend, but not much interest in Torrey Smith or Alshon Jeffrey.
Moving on to the tight ends, I have absolutely no interest in Austin Hooper, and I know you agree, so I think we just move on to Ertz.
Yep.
Okay. So Ertz is a little too close in price to Gronkowski on FanDuel, so I don't have too much interest in him there unless using him as a leverage play off of Gronk. But I like the DK value, and I could see a few lineups with both of them in the flex. So he dropped a 6.56-1 line with Foles against the Giants. Trey Burton also scored a touchdown in that game. He saw 14 targets, 9 receptions, 81 yards against Oakland. Then just 1 quarter against Dallas, 2 targets, 2 receptions, 24 yards. He's accounting for 28.7% of Foles' pass attempts in starts this season. That's compared to only 17.5% of Carson Wentz attempts. Really, the matchup is just average, but I do like Ertz quite a bit.
Yeah, it's hard not to like Ertz this week. I mean, he's been really easy to like all year. He is averaging just under 15 DraftKings points per game. His salary is only $5,800 on DraftKings. Like you said, using him in the flex is a great option this weekend. Some of the players he's priced around are Ted Ginn, Devontae Freeman, Rex Burkhead, Mohamed Sanu. I think Ertz easily has the most touchdown upside out of any of those players and should be the focal point of Philadelphia's offense once again. Like you said, it's not a great matchup, but you're not going to find a perfect matchup with only 4 games to choose from, and Ertz has just been so consistent this year. I think you can safely go back to him again.
This brings us to our next game, Tennessee at New England. New England is 13.5-point favorites. Last week we mentioned Mariota's rushing upside. He's rushed the ball 18 times over the past 2 weeks, both games being must-win games. This is 4 more than his previous 2-week record over his career, also 106 rushing yards. New England runs man coverage at the highest rate in the league. We've talked about this before, but really it's just easier for mobile quarterbacks to run on a defense when their defensive backs have their backs turned to that quarterback. New England ranks 7th worst in schedule-adjusted fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. All this being said, I think Bill Belichick has a counter for this. I bet he rushes Marcus Mariota, or at least spies him, like they've done to Tyrod Taylor. They've held him in check throughout his career as well. Schedule-adjusted fantasy points thing, really, that's just a product of a lot of negative game script for opposing passers. New England leads a lot, and then there's a lot of garbage time to make up the difference. But on a per target, per attempt, per drop back basis, New England's at the very worst average in all categories and far more susceptible probably on the ground. I'm not on Mariota, and I know you're not either.
Yeah, I'm not on Mariota either. There are a couple of interesting positive things about him. I did discover this week that he only threw 13 touchdown passes this year, but 9 of them came on play action, and Mariota was actually the most efficient play action passer in the league this year. Basically 10% of his play action passes went for touchdowns, and his passer rating on such plays was 122.8, tops in the league. So if Tennessee can manage to get their running game going and keep the game competitive, I think Mariota is actually a pretty good play. But yeah, he's only thrown for 2 touchdowns in 4 games this year. He hasn't thrown for more than 2 touchdowns in any games. I'm not interested in Mariota, but I guess if I'm making 150 GPP lineups, he's going to be in a few of them. But other than that, not interested.
What about your boy, Tom Brady? I have a few concerns here. So he averaged 21.2 fantasy points per game across the first 10 weeks of the season. Since week 11, when he first popped up on the injury report with an Achilles injury, he's averaged only 14.2 fantasy points per game. This is across 6 games, though. He wasn't listed on the injury report this week after a week off. He's also seen pass attempts fall by 4.5, passer rating drop from 110.9 to 87.3 over this stretch. That's legitimately a concern for me. On top of that, New England has had one of the best rushing offenses in the league since week 5. 3rd most rushing yards, 3rd most rushing touchdowns, 3rd best yards per carry. Tennessee is allowed the 8th most passing yards, but the 4th fewest rushing yards to opposing offenses this season. Still, with that 13.5 point spread, it's hard to imagine that Brady is going to have to go through the air too much. What are your thoughts, Tyler?
Well, they have to get a 13.5 point lead somehow. So if Brady's going to do his damage, it's going to come probably in the first half. I agree with you that there are some red flags here. But again, with only 8 teams to choose from, we can't, beggars can't be choosers here. Brady does have some positive things going for him with this matchup. Obviously, he led the league in passing. He's probably going to be the MVP. The Patriots have the highest implied total. They're typically great at home. And he's not outrageously expensive either. I know he is the most expensive quarterback by a decent margin, but it wasn't quite as much as I was expecting. I think that given these red flags, the red flags and his price, ownership might be a little bit lower, which makes Brady one of my favorite GPP plays. And the Titans gave up 4 passing scores in 4 games this year, and no other team gave up more than 2 such games. So the Titans have been susceptible to some huge games from quarterbacks. Brady obviously has 4 or 5 touchdown upside. So I do like him in GPPs. Again, I'm not totally in love with the play, just given like you mentioned, the success of New England's rushing game recently. But the matchup is great, and Brady has the highest ceiling of any quarterback playing this week.
Good stats all around, and I really liked your stats on Marcus Mariota on the play action if Tennessee can get the ground game going. And I think they really, might be able to, unless they get out to that gigantic lead early. I think Henry's a really good play with DeMarco Murray out. Henry was on the field for 128 of the team's 134 running back snaps over the past 2 weeks. He handled all 51 of the carries, all 3 of the running back targets, totaled 308 yards and 2 touchdowns. Really, he's been one of our most efficient running backs since entering the league, ranking top 6 in yards after contact per attempt, missed tackles forced per attempt. Game script's a concern because, you see those target totals and they are low, implying maybe the team doesn't trust him fully as a receiver. But this is probably New England's worst run defense potentially ever since Bill Belichick's been there. He ranks 2nd worst in yards per carry allowed, 7th worst in receiving fantasy points per game allowed to opposing running backs. I think Tennessee tries to establish the ground game early and often. And if things are close in the beginning of this game, I could see Henry posting a big day. He's still a little too expensive for me on DraftKings, but he's a really good value on FanDuel.
Yeah, that's what I was just about to mention. Henry is probably going to be the first player I put into my FanDuel lineups. He's just way, way, way too cheap over there at, what's his price, 6,700. He's actually the cheapest RB1. So like the team's primary running back, he's the cheapest of the 8 playing this week. But at 7,300 on DraftKings, it's hard to put him in there. He's 400 more expensive than Leonard Fournette. He's 700 more expensive than Dion Lewis, both of whom I think just straight up are better plays than him. Game script, obviously the biggest concern. We did see Henry last week. The Titans definitely don't love him in there on passing downs. He completely missed a blitz pickup and got Mariota smoked on the forward progress, no fumble play. It's Henry would need to do a little too much, I think, to pay off his 7,300 salary on DraftKings. But if the Titans are going to score, my best guess is Henry. So I like him over on FanDuel. You mentioned New England's rush defense. I just looked it up. They have only given up 3 rushing touchdowns to opposing running backs since Kareem Hunt blew them up in week 1. But they have given up a lot of yards. So this could be a game where Henry gains some decent yards if the Titans are able to keep it close. But I mentioned earlier, if they score, it'll be Henry. But looking at it some more, the Patriots don't give up a lot of rushing touchdowns to opposing running backs. So I think he's off the board for me on DraftKings, and he's definitely in my lineup on FanDuel.
Yeah, right. I feel the same way. And like we were talking earlier, maybe before the podcast, Tennessee's implied total is really low.
Yeah, it's under 17 points.
Well, what about these New England running backs? You said you like Dion Lewis. Let's hear your pitch on him.
I do like Dion Lewis. So there was a report on Wednesday that Rex Burkhead was, quote, heavily favoring his left knee. That's from the Boston Herald. If Burkhead doesn't go, I don't see any way you can get away from Dion Lewis in your lineup. He scored over 31 DraftKings points in 2 straight games. He scored 4 touchdowns in weeks 16 and 17. He averaged over 30 touches in those games. Lewis is an absolute workhorse without Burkhead in the lineup. James White didn't even notch a rushing attempt in either of those 2 games. Even with Burkhead back, I think the Patriots have a hot hand in Lewis. You could make the argument that they sort of saved him for the playoffs a little bit. I do. And especially if Burkhead is hobbled, the Patriots will probably ease him back into the lineup, especially because they don't have to do it with such a hot hand in Lewis. He's definitely one of my favorite plays this weekend, especially as nearly 2 touchdown home favorites. I love Lewis this weekend.
I'm with you. He's one of my top running back plays of the week. I will say, and shout out to RotoWorld's Evan Silva for turning me on to this, but I think James White's in play too as a contrarian play, punt play, salary saver. He's just kind of interesting if he is active. He's practiced. He hasn't missed a single practice over the past 2 weeks, despite not playing in each of the team's past 2 games. And Tennessee's defense is kind of similar to Atlanta's last season, when White saw 16 targets, catching 14 for 110 yards and a score, and was really a near Super Bowl MVP winning performance. Atlanta allowed the most receiving fantasy points per game to running backs last season, ranked slightly above average on the ground. This season, Tennessee's allowing the most receiving fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, but the second fewest on the ground. So really, it is a tough matchup for Dion Lewis. Is a better matchup for whichever running backs seeing the receiving work. It's risky for sure knowing Bill Belichick's history, but I do think he is in play.
Yeah, White is a good salary saver. If you believe in the narrative for the past few postseasons, James White always seems to come through for the Patriots. You were mentioning how poor the Titans are against running backs out of the backfield. They gave up a league high 967 receiving yards to running backs this year. No other team gave up over 900 yards, so they were well ahead, or well behind the league, I should say. So yeah, it's not a smash spot for White, but his recent playoff history, the way the Patriots kind of unleash some new player every game in the playoffs, it could be White again. I don't hate the play. He's not a core player, obviously, but if Burkhead's out in particular, I think you can definitely use White as a salary saver.
All right, moving on to the wide receivers. Over the past 4 weeks, Corey Davis seen the best workload of all the receivers, 11.2 expected fantasy points per game, followed by Decker's 10.6, followed by Matthews' 6.9. Matthews' recent usage pushes him out of contention for me, while Davis has a tough matchup against Stephon Gilmore, and just season-long efficiency has been really poor. He ranks 92nd of 93 qualifying wide receivers and passer rating when targeted. Decker, meanwhile, ran 89% of his routes from the slot last week. New England is allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing slot wide receivers, only the 16th most to outside wide receivers. He draws Eric Rowe, one of our worst rated cornerbacks this season. I don't love Eric Decker. I think he's still like a mediocre to poor on paper play, but at salary, he's a guy I'll probably have in a bunch of lineups.
I want to like the Tennessee receivers because they're all cheap, and you need some salary relief on weeks like this. But other than Decker, it's hard to like any of these guys. You mentioned the matchup against Stephon Gilmore with Corey Davis. He's the cheapest of the three, at least on DraftKings. Gilmore's only targeted on 15% of his routes covered, which is the lowest rate among all right cornerbacks this weekend. I just don't think Davis is going to see the requisite volume, even to return value on such a cheap salary. We did see Eric Decker predictably get some red zone work last week. I could see it again this week. You mentioned the positive matchup for him. Again, not a great play, but game script should favor these guys. Decker's really the only one I have interest in, though.
Looking at the New England wide receivers, Chris Hogan is still limited, but he's expected to play with that shoulder injury. Just note that when he was on the field, he was a low-end wide receiver too. In expected and actual fantasy points per game, could be slept on if he does play this week. Brandon Cooks would see a dent in production if Hogan were active. He's averaging 2.6 fantasy points per game more in games Hogan has missed. The matchup, I don't think is really strong for him. Adoree Jackson was a guy we picked on early in the season, but his play started to improve in the second half. Brandon Cooks ranks fourth among all receivers in deep targets per game. Tennessee ranks fifth best in deep fantasy points per game allowed to opposing wide receivers. They've especially held speedsters in check. Adoree Jackson, while he might still not be one of the better cornerbacks in the league, he is fast with a 4.42 40-yard dash at his combine last season. And we saw Kansas City move away from the deep ball against them and instead attacking with Tyreek Hill underneath for one of his lowest ADOTs of the season. Really not interested in any of these guys too much, and especially not in guys like Philip Dorsett, Kenny Britt. Do you have anything to add before we move on to the tight ends?
No, I don't have much to add. If I'm stacking Brady, I'm stacking him with Gronkowski. So good segue to the tight ends there.
Well, I completely agree. Let's hear your pitch on Gronk, though. I'm not sure you need too much of one.
Yeah, I don't know how much of a pitch you really need for Gronkowski. Has the most yardage upside, most touchdown upside. He can score 3 touchdowns at any time. Gronkowski saw 11 targets and 13 targets in weeks 13 and 15 before he wasn't even targeted in week 17 for the first time in his career. The Patriots obviously know that he's their most important player on offense outside of Brady. They put him in bubble wrap, ready to unleash him here. We did see Travis Kelce absolutely work this Titans defense in the first half before he was unfortunately knocked out of the game. I don't see any reason why Gronkowski wouldn't be the top scoring tight end this week. And even considering his salary, I still like him the most.
So week 17, maybe Bill Belichick wanted to keep him in bubble wrap, like you said, or maybe he wanted to end the season with his favorite number of 69 receptions.
Nice.
But if it is the case, he only needs 17 catches this week for 69 career postseason receptions.
He actually could do it. If the Patriots just threw to Gronkowski every play, he would catch 17 passes.
And maybe they should. I will just say that during the fantasy season, he ranked third among all receivers in fantasy points per game. He's legitimately neck and neck, in my opinion, with Julio Jones and Antonio Brown as the top receiver plays of the week. Ignoring ownership, he will be extremely highly owned on both sites. The matchup's good too. Tennessee ranks 7th worst in schedule adjusted fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. Delaney Walker's in play too. Hearing Belichick's comments yesterday on the Tennessee Titans roster, it was interesting to hear him say, obviously their tight end, Delanie Walker, is one of the top players in the league, highlighting him over the running backs and over the wide receivers. You've done some work that I'll let you speak on in just a little bit regarding how New England attacks an opposing team's top option. That's probably Derrick Henry. But after that, I guess it is Walker, who, while the matchup doesn't really stand out, volume has been good for him all season. He leads all tight ends and ranks 15th among all receivers in expected fantasy points since week 10. Clearly the top option on his team in terms of expected fantasy points and targets. One of the top players in receiving expected touchdown market share, which is a mouthful, but really just means when Mariota's looking to throw a touchdown, he typically looks in Walker's direction.
So you mentioned the research I did on Patriots shutting down opposing teams' number ones. It's not often that a team's best player is their tight end. So there was actually inconclusive evidence for whether or not Patriots effectively shut down opposing teams' tight ends. But I will say that I also like Walker this week. He's much cheaper than Ertz. He's much cheaper than Gronkowski. Definitely a viable salary relief option there who will still produce for you. He had 5 targets in all but one game this year, so his volume is secure. I'm with you on Walker. I don't have a problem playing him, especially in a game where the Titans are probably going to have to be playing catch up. Walker should easily surpass 5 targets in this game.
All right, Tyler, moving on to Jacksonville at Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh favored by 7.5. Do you have any interest in Blake Bortles?
I don't have interest in Blake Bortles outside of a few deep GPP darts because he actually was one of fantasy's hottest quarterbacks down the stretch. But I did come across a great stat with him. He joined Michael Vick as the only other quarterback in NFL history to win a playoff game while rushing for more yards than he passed for. But I will note that he threw for under 100 yards last week, and the last time he threw for under 100 yards was back in week 5 against Pittsburgh. It was kind of a weird game. Obviously, Big Ben threw 5 interceptions. There's going to be different game script this time around. Bortles is going to be extremely low owned, which is why I have interest in him in GPPs. But it's Blake Bortles, and I trust this Pittsburgh team way more in the playoffs, quarterbacked by Big Ben. Very little interest in Bortles here.
Interesting stats all around. I have 0 interest in Blake Bortles and will not play him. And if he blows up this slate and I lose a lot of money, I'm still going to feel pretty good about that. Ben Roethlisberger, on the other hand, I think is a legitimately interesting contrarian play. He's going to go low owned just because the Jaguars have this historic defense. What do I mean by that? Over the past decade, they ranked top 7 in opposing passer rating and yards per attempt. This is a really good defense that Ben had one of his worst games ever against at home in week 5, throwing 5 interceptions with 0 touchdowns. The matchup is definitely poor for Ben, but I mean, he could rise above it. Since 2014, he averages 14 fantasy points per game on the road. That's worse than Blake Bortles over this stretch, but 23.3 fantasy points per game at home. That's easily the most. All 10 of his top 10, 14 of his top 16 highest scoring games have come at home over this stretch. He's also been our highest rated passer since week 6, since week 7, since week 8, and almost every week since. I think he's still extremely risky, but he's a guy who's projected to draw low ownership and does have considerable upside.
Yeah, he did throw for 2 touchdowns in 7 straight games before sitting out in week 17 too. So he is riding a hot streak. And like you said, literally nobody's going to own him. Roethlisberger's quarterback rating actually would have been higher in week 5 if he just spiked it on every play. And you're wrong. He did throw some touchdowns in that game. They just went to Jacksonville instead.
Moving on to the running backs, I like Leonard Fournette quite a bit. He's a guy I've harped on all season. He averages just 3.25 yards per carry if we remove his 2 longest runs of the season. He would easily rank last in the league. He's struggled running against stacked boxes. I'll give him that, but I mean, every defense is going to do that, including the Steelers this week. He had a dream matchup last week against Buffalo. And yet again, this looks like another dream matchup. The Steelers defense has struggled mightily against running backs since losing linebacker Ryan Shazier. They ranked 6th worst in yards per carry allowed for the season. Dead last in fantasy points per game allowed to running backs since week 12. The efficiency has not been good. Volume has been great since week 13. Fournette averages 20.2 carries per game, 4.2 targets per game. That's behind just Todd Gurley in opportunities per game. He's also seen his highest snap counts come in 5 of these past 6 games. I like Fournette, and I think people are going to be off him after last week's disappointing outcome.
Fournette is one of my favorite running backs this week. You mentioned how atrocious Pittsburgh has been against the run down the stretch. They gave up over 110 yards to Cincinnati, to Baltimore, to Houston. They gave up 6 combined rushing touchdowns to Baltimore, New England, and Cleveland. And this is all just in the final 6 weeks of the year. Fournette also had his best game of the year against the Steelers. I know he had a long run. That's not going to happen every week. But there is something to be said about his stat line that game. 28 rushing attempts, 181 yards, 2 touchdowns. All of those were season highs or tied for season highs. Fournette, after a really disappointing week last week, is definitely somewhat of a contrarian play, especially as big underdogs here. But the matchup is great. Fournette is going to get 20-plus touches. I don't see a problem with this I don't see a problem with playing Fournette here.
Another guy we're going to want a lot of exposure to, though he is very pricey, is Le'Veon Bell. He's kind of the poster boy of my expected fantasy point stat. Last season, he broke the record for the most expected fantasy points per game by any player this past decade. He broke that again this season. He's seen 30 touches in the only 2 postseason games he started and finished. Jaguars ranked 7th worst in yards per carry allowed this season, but 4th best since trading for Marcel Darius in week 9. The matchup's not great, but it's going to be worse for any other Pittsburgh player on offense. I'd rather have Bell than Brown, and he's probably a guy I'm going to be trying to jam into my lineups.
Jacksonville did rank bottom 5 in fantasy points per opportunity given up to running backs on the ground. You don't really need to sell Le'Veon Bell. You know, he's going to see a ton of work both on the ground and through the air. Price is really the only constraint here. It is a tight week, obviously, with only 8 teams left, presumably the 8 best teams in the league. You got a bunch of superstars playing this week. Whether or not you can fit Bell into the lineup is really the only question. I will add that Bell did see 10 targets and caught all 10 of those looks against Jacksonville back in week 5. That was his 2nd highest reception total of the year.
All right, well, let's jump into the Jacksonville wide receivers, which I think is a tough position group to nail down. Marquise Lee was limited last week, and really this has become a 4-way committee where all 4 wide receivers played on at least 30 snaps. Though D.D. Westbrook did see the highest snap total with 35 of the team's 59. He also saw 8 targets when Hearns only saw 1, Cole saw 1, and Lee saw 0. He's probably your safest bet. I'll also add that 32% of his fantasy points have come on deep balls this season. That's one of the highest rates in the league. And Pittsburgh's giving it the 5th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers on deep passes. Lee is not used in that regard. Cole is. Hearns sometimes can, though I will say that stat is more representative of when Pittsburgh was without Joe Hayden in the lineup. Really, we both like Leonard Fournette and think this is going to be a run-heavy affair, but I do think Westbrook's somewhat intriguing. What would you say?
Yeah, Westbrook's the only Jacksonville receiver I'm interested in. He's averaging over 7 targets per game since entering the lineup in Week 11. He's really been the only guy who's produced every week. Sometimes extremely inefficient. I should say produced from a target perspective. He had only 1 game with fewer than 6 targets. He's not a core play of mine with overall rankings, but when factoring in his salary, I actually do think he's one of the better plays of the weekend.
I'm staring at my write-up for the Pittsburgh wide receivers, and it's like 8,000 words. So let me hear what you have to say on the Pittsburgh wide receivers this week.
Sure. So even though the matchup against the Jaguars in week 5 was just an absolute train wreck for the Steelers, their receivers did post 20 receptions for 242 yards against Jacksonville, and both of those were season highs given up by Jacksonville this year. Antonio Brown is literally matchup proof. He had 10 catches for over 150 yards against the Jaguars. So even though Jalen Ramsey is amazing, Antonio Brown is the wide receiver of this generation. So don't worry about that matchup. I actually think Brown is a fantastic GPP play because I do think people will worry about the matchup. I think the narrative that Big Ben threw no touchdowns and 5 picks is permeating everywhere. Everyone knows that the Jaguars are a historically great pass defense this year. Antonio Brown is coming off of this injury. He's actually maybe my favorite GPP play of the week.
You were implying Antonio Brown's borderline immune to good cornerbacks, and that's exactly what my data has shown over the past decade. Only Percy Harvin of like 800 qualifying wide receivers ranks better in fantasy points per target against top 20 graded cornerbacks. Brown also averages 11 targets and 109 receiving yards per game over his last postseason games. I am with you on Brown. I'm not too concerned about this matchup, though I will say if you don't think he's 100% and early reports indicating he is 100%, I think that does make Juju Smith-Schuster an interesting contrarian leverage play off of Brown. What do you think there?
I guess it depends how not 100% Antonio Brown is, because I'm pretty in love with Brown this weekend. He's also 1,500 cheaper than Le'Veon Bell on DraftKings, which is a huge difference. Juju has been on fire. He's great in the red zone, has shown great rapport with Ben Roethlisberger. But his floor does kind of concern me. He has fewer than 10 DraftKings points in 2 games, kind of wedged in between his great run. I think he had like 4 catches for 40 yards and 4 catches for 17 yards in 2 straight games. And a stat line like that could really burn you in a short slate. If Brown is a no-go for whatever reason, or he's a game-time decision, he's truthfully really not 100%, then yeah, Smith-Schuster is much more interesting to me. But if Brown is on the field, I'm not interested in Juju here.
Great argument all around. Yeah, I firmly agree with your analysis there. Moving on to the tight ends, Mercedes Lewis is never in play unless Maurice Jones-Drew tells you to go all in before the game. Pittsburgh's tight ends, since Vance McDonald returned from an ankle injury 2 weeks ago, he's seen 66 snaps and 7 targets. Jesse James has seen 69 snaps and 3 targets. If you want to play one, play Vance McDonald. Otherwise, avoid, and I will likely avoid. So we can move on to our final game of this slate, potentially the most interesting. New Orleans at Minnesota, with Minnesota favored by 4. Drew Brees, I think despite the tough matchup, is interesting. I mean, it is a tough matchup. Minnesota ranks best in fantasy points per game, fantasy points per dropback allowed to opposing quarterbacks this season. Still, it's Drew Brees. He ranks behind only Kurt Warner in career postseason passer rating. What's kind of hurt Drew Brees this season by every efficiency metric I look at, and we talked about this last week, it's just that the team has relied so heavily on the ground game this season. He's still one of the top 3 quarterbacks in this league. Just attempts have really fallen off. Pass attempts per game have dropped off by 7.9 per game compared to his prior 7-year average. But again, efficiency's been good all around. Maybe in this matchup as 4-point underdogs, it forces them to go a little bit more pass heavy. Again, this matchup's tough, and Minnesota's allowed the fewest points per game of any home defense this season, just 12.5. Still, it's Drew Brees, and he posted a somewhat respectable line in week 1 against them. 27 of 37 for 291 and a score, 0 interceptions. What do you think about Brees, Tyler?
I don't hate Brees, but he's definitely not my favorite quarterback this week. The matchup, there's just better matchups to attack this weekend. I actually like Case Keenum on the other side of this game more, factoring in price. Keenum is the fourth most expensive option on DraftKings and the fifth most expensive option on FanDuel. And since week 10, from weeks 10 through 17, Keenum was actually tied for fourth among all quarterbacks in fantasy points. That stat blew my mind. He's too cheap and too strong of a play here, as the Vikings are the team with the second highest implied total of the weekend. This game has the highest shootout potential of any of the games this weekend. The Saints are a middle-of-the-pack team against quarterbacks from a fantasy perspective, but middle of the pack is about as good as you can get in the divisional round here. They were exposed last weekend for 349 passing yards and 2 touchdowns, plus a dropped touchdown against the Panthers last weekend. And for as accurate as Drew Brees is, and he did set an accuracy record this year, Keenum is also extremely accurate. He was ranked tied for fourth in accuracy rating this year at 76.5%.
Yeah, people are sleeping on Keenum this season, even though he's our 9th highest rated quarterback this season. It's interesting to note Sam Bradford destroyed this defense in week 1, completing 27 of 32 for 346 yards, 3 touchdowns, no interceptions. Also, maybe it's interesting that Vegas has New Orleans projected to score 21.75 points this week. 5 of Keenum or Bradford's top 6 fantasy scoring games this season have come when opponents have scored 17 or more points. I'm with you. I do like Keenum quite a bit. We can move on to the running backs, which I actually think are a little bit more interesting. Tyler, Alvin Kamara has been the guy all season. He's seeing an increased workload in recent weeks. But Mark Ingram is just so cheap on DraftKings. What are you doing?
Yeah, I played Kamara like every week from weeks 1 through 6, and then he just got more and more expensive. And actually, basically ever since week 10, I haven't played him, and I know that has burned me a few times. I think he's just way too expensive to play in cash games. I know I'm not playing cash, but some of our listeners might be. He only touches the ball 10, maybe 15 times a game. He can score from anywhere on the field, so he's still in play for GPPs. But I agree with you. Mark Ingram is the better play here. He's way cheaper. He's only $5,600 on DraftKings. Alvin Kamara is $2,200 more expensive, up at $7,800. Ingram lost the goal line work last week, but they kind of flip-flopped there, so Ingram could be the guy scoring 2 touchdowns next week. Ingram's floor scares me and might keep me away here with fewer than 10 DraftKings points in 2 straight games. I mentioned earlier, a poor game like that on a short slate could burn your lineup. But he's only $5,600. The Saints are going to lean on the run like they have all year. It's a tough matchup. That's probably why he's cheaper. But the price tag is just drawing me into Ingram.
Yeah, I mean, I still think Kamara is interesting. He definitely has tournament-winning upside. We've seen it time and time again this season. Also, what's really interesting is like Sean Payton seems to be indicating a clear preference to Kamara over Ingram. Kamara has topped Ingram in expected fantasy points in 6 of his last 7 healthy games. He's played on 58% of the team snaps to Ingram's 51%. 4.5 point underdogs that would help Kamara more than Ingram. Minnesota's been equally good to running backs on the ground and through the air, but really Kamara's not your typical scat back. He's running 44% of his routes as a wide receiver, not as a running back. I mean, it's going to be hard for me to really pick one to like, but just know that they're both in play. Looking at the other side of the ball, we have Latavius Murray and Jerick McKinnon. Do you have a favorite of those two?
Oh, yeah. Murray all the way for me. Murray has actually been one of fantasy's best running backs since week 10. He ranked 7th in fantasy points. That was standard leagues. I believe he was 10th in PPR leagues. He was kind of right up there with guys like LaShawn McCoy and Melvin Gordon in that stretch. His 7 rushing touchdowns since week 10 were second most in the league. He has 20-plus rushing attempts in 3 straight games, and he's basically riding a 2-month-long hot streak. He's clearly the better back to own in DFS this weekend, and he's not that much more expensive than McKinnon. I think Murray is just an absolute smash play here as home favorites.
Yeah, I'm with you. Since their bye, Murray's averaging 13.8 expected fantasy points per game to McKinnon's 10.8. McKinnon has 1 touchdown in his last 8 games. Murray has 7 touchdowns in his last 8 games. Minnesota's won 11 of their last 12. We haven't really seen them with negative game scripts, so maybe Breeze just crushes and McKinnon has this monster game. But I don't know that that's something I really want to bet on. We can move to the wide receivers and have a nice little debate here potentially. So Michael Thomas is going to draw Xavier Rhodes in shadow coverage. In shadow games against Antonio Brown, Mike Evans, Marvin Jones twice, Devontae Adams, Josh Doxson, Julio Jones, Devin Funchess, AJ Green, Dontrell Inman. Only one time has a wide receiver reached even double-digit fantasy points against Rhodes in coverage. That really takes him out of contention for me in this tough matchup. Rhodes has just been that good this season, and as good as Rhodes has been, Trey Waynes, on the opposite side of him, has been one of the worst. He's played a little better in recent weeks, but still for the season, he ranks bottom 25 among 86 cornerbacks in fantasy points per route, fantasy points per target allowed. Ginn has not seen good volume by any metric I would typically look at. He has been extremely efficient. He ranks 3rd of 93 qualifying wide receivers in passer rating when targeted. Also, what's interesting is 51.7% of his fantasy production has come on balls thrown 15 or more yards through the air. That's 5th of 72 receivers, while Waynes has surrendered the 2nd most completions of all cornerbacks on balls thrown 15 or more yards through the air. Just looking at price, especially on FanDuel where Ginn is cheap, I like him quite a bit, and I don't see myself rostering Thomas on any lineup this week.
Yeah, I'm with you across the board there. I wish Ginn didn't catch an 80-yard touchdown last week because I think this is an even better matchup for him. But I think his ownership is going to skyrocket because he was so good last week. That's really my only drawback with Ginn here, is that I think his ownership will be higher than it should be. I agree with you that factoring in the price, Ginn is a better play than Thomas this week. And I don't think you need to force Thomas into your lineup with the matchup against Rhodes.
I'm with you, and I think Minnesota kind of operates similarly as a wide receiving core. So in week 1, Thielen saw 10 targets for 157 yards against New Orleans. Stephon Diggs saw 8 targets for 93 yards and 2 scores. What's worth noting is that Marshawn Lattimore did not shadow either wide receiver in this game, but we're projecting Lattimore to shadow Diggs this week. That pushes Diggs out of contention for me. Lattimore's our 4th highest rated cornerback this season. He ranks top 15 of 86 qualifying quarterbacks, fantasy points allowed per route, fantasy points allowed per target. That's despite shadowing names like Brandon Cooks, Devontae Adams, Julio Jones twice, Mike Evans, and more. So I'm not playing Diggs this week. I will play Adam Thielen, however, who ran 65% of his routes from the slot in week 17, and will draw Kenny Vaccaro's backup. He was placed on IR a few weeks ago in PJ Williams. He's been our 10th highest rated wide receiver this season. He ranks 10th in expected fantasy points per game, 10th in actual fantasy points per game, 5th in receiving yards. Monster, hyper-efficient season. I like him quite a bit. He's a little too pricey on DraftKings maybe, but he's a better value on FanDuel.
Yeah, I actually love Thielen this week. I think he's maybe my favorite wide receiver, all things considered, outside of Julio Jones and Antonio Brown, of course. Over the final month and a half or 2 months of the year, the Saints were ripped apart by slot receivers Jamison Crowder, Mohamed Sanu, Cooper Kupp, Adam Humphries, and then last week's pseudo slot man Christian McCaffrey all had huge games against them. And we PFF charged Saints cornerbacks with giving up 10 passing touchdowns this year when in coverage, and 9 of them came to receivers running routes out of the slot. So this is the week for Adam Thielen.
I love it. All right. Well, what about the tight ends for the Saints? No interest in Josh Hill. I don't think we need to go too in-depth as to why that's a bad play, despite him scoring a touchdown last week. What about Kyle Rudolph? Any interest?
I never played Kyle Rudolph this year, I don't think, and it burned me more often than not. But I will note that down the stretch, Rudolph was not a good option. He caught just 7 passes over his final 4 games. That is not good volume, especially when someone like Delaney Walker is not that much more expensive. Take that with a grain of salt. Like I said, I pretty much never play Rudolph, so I'm not sure why I would change that this week. Do you have a different opinion there?
Yeah, so I just thought the same thing because after Dalvin Cook's injury in week 4, he had 6 straight games with at least 7 targets. And then since then, 4, 5, 5, 2, 1, 3 targets. And I think that's related to his ankle injury that he suffered somewhere around the start of those target numbers you were hearing. But he's practicing in full this week after a week off. Still, he's going to be entirely touchdown dependent. He's averaging just 35.3 yards per game since week 5, but he does have 5 touchdowns in his last 6 games, so really he's going to be touchdown dependent. But I don't think a lot of people are going to be on him, and I do want to mention too that the Saints have what looks like a tough tight end matchup on paper, but their primary tight end defender was Kenny Vaccaro, who's hurt. Von Bell, who ranked 65th of 84 safeties in pass coverage grade. The Saints, again, they look good on paper, but you have to look at who they've played. A hobbled Cameron Brate, ASJ with Petty at quarterback, Hooper twice, Carolina without Olsen, the Rams tight ends. And then finally, they get a decent tight end in Greg Olsen last week, and he exploded for 8 receptions, 107 yards, 1 touchdown on 12 targets.
Yeah, I think you mentioned that the touchdown upside for Rudolph, that keeps him in play for me on FanDuel, but on DraftKings, where the receptions are worth a whole point, you get the 100-yard bonus with guys like Gronkowski and Ertz, and even Walker on the slate. I just don't see myself going to Rudolph on DraftKings. But on FanDuel, like you said, he did have a pretty good streak of scoring touchdowns there. So I'm open to him. I'm open to him on FanDuel.
Right, Tyler. I'm with you. Great stats all around. Good analysis. I think we're over our time limit here, so I'll sign off. Why don't you tell the listeners at home where they can find you on Twitter, what articles to check out this week?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Loechner NFL. My articles this week are DFS fades, DFS locks, a FanDuel guide where I go through every viable player, and 26 stats to know for the divisional round.
All right, that's Loechner, Loechner. Tyler, thanks so much for coming on, and thank you to all of our listeners at home who are liking this podcast, subscribing, retweeting, leaving 5-star reviews, stuff like that. That makes me really happy. So thank you for that, and we will see you all next week for a smaller slate.